things that we've been asked to do is comment on what we see as the operational transition issues. Amongst the board members, I'll share Stavros and my thoughts on that. That will be coming to you later this week. So be prepared to receive that, and certainly would welcome input from you and any questions and comments. We plan on being transparent with the full board and have many conversations about our approach to issues of transition. December, we had planned, as you know, to go to Madrid for an in-person December meeting. One of the most important elements was to celebrate the successes and the contributions of our 3 departing members who second terms are retiring from the board. Sadly, because of the pandemic, that is not going to occur at our December meeting. But trust me, we will find ways to celebrate their contributions. But I thought I'd turn it over to Billy right now to explain what's happening in December.
Thank you very much, Tom. So last week at the Planning Committee meeting, we did have a long discussion with the Planning Committee around this. Obviously, even at the Planning Committee last week, a lot of disappointment around the table in terms of the decision that we had to make, but also realizing that this is probably the reality. Soon after the June meeting, the PIOB did highlight to us their concerns regarding hosting an in-physical meeting in Madrid in December, both from a perspective of obviously people traveling there, but also from a perspective of hosting people. We obviously consider that if Madrid is not a possibility, we could think about New York, but again, the same considerations come up in terms of people traveling from or to the US. We're also very conscious of the fact that, you're talking about hosting a group of 40+ people for 5 days in a confined space. That is also a big factor that was taken into account. And then, as we've seen regrettably in the last few weeks, different countries all over the world are experiencing the pandemic at different rates. And various countries are also, including the US, are also experiencing regression at some stages where people go back into lockdown, and amid all these uncertainties, I think the decision was clear that we need to plan for a virtual scenario in December. What is important is that obviously has a big effect on the work plan, because in a physical meeting, normally depending on the agenda, we're talking about between 28 and 34, 36 hours of plenary time. When as soon as you convert it to a virtual meeting, you're down to, and especially if you want to keep it over December in 1 week, you're probably down to a maximum of 18 hours. So that means we have to look at the projects that go to the December meeting. We have decided, and this is in the context of our work plan and our forward planning, as well as in terms of budget, for budget purposes for 2021, we have identified certain projects as priority projects. Not that any of our projects are not important, all our projects are important, but in terms of making decisions around the projects that are first in the queue, or conversely, that will last be affected by any adjustments to timelines. After the queuing projects, we see those projects as being group audits, audit evidence, and then the 2 LCE work streams. And based on those decisions, we will put the agenda together that we will share with the board in due course. There's probably obviously going to be a knock-on effect into 2021. We have certain options available to us in terms of, as we're going to do in Q4 this year, maybe using 2-day board calls to catch up on some of the items. We've been actually able to look at the forward plan where none of the targeted dates had to move out yet. The only date that will move out is the framework for activities will now only be approved in March. However, we are at the point now where if anything further changes, it will probably start to affect timelines and target dates. So Tom, thank you very much. I thought I just wanted to give that background. We will continue to work on the first draft of the agenda, and then we'll share that with the board in due course.
Okay, I'll pause there for a second. Anyone have anything they wish to raise or ask before we turn to the main event? Okay, I see no hands. So I think people regret that we're not meeting in person, and trust me, we want to get to meet in person as soon as possible, but the reality is what it is. And so we're making the best with what we can do. And so I appreciate your patience on this. And I'm fully committed to have an in-person meeting as soon as it's practical from a health and safety standpoint. Okay, today, fraud and going concern, and the focus is on the draft discussion paper. I think people will realize that we've put these topics on fast track. We said we would do it, and we are. And I have to commend the team, particularly Bev and Angela and all those who are assisting them and inputted with the speed by which they're working to deal with these crucial public interest issues. And the discussion paper itself really is only one of many activities that are underway. But today, the real focus is to begin a real public conversation trigger that is focused on the discussion paper and the questions around it. One thing, as you know, that in the document we talk about an accelerating. Trust me, this was a desire to get moving and get working and meet our public interest commitments to have an October 30th deadline. We've heard enough on that topic, particularly the COVID environment. That may not be practical. So when we get to that, we'll talk about how we're going to respond to that comment. But trust me, we've heard loud and clear that that short comment period may not be practical. Josephine, I want to turn it over to you right now for some introductory comments.
Great, thank you, and good morning, evening, and afternoon to all. As Tom said, you'll recall back at the March meeting, Tom and Fiona gave the board a reminder of the commitments we made in our strategy and work plan in relation to the topics of going concern and fraud, and of course an update on the work that had actually already been started at that time in the background, and of course to meet those commitments. So since March, Bev and Angela have been working really hard to meet the milestones that Fiona put forward in that March presentation, and Fiona and Tom, Willie and I have been supporting them in that work. Similar to Tom, I do want to take a moment to say huge thanks to Bev and Angela for the incredible amount of work they've achieved in such a short period of time, and of course producing such excellent quality outputs as always. Now, given it is all their hard work, you actually won't be hearing much from me at all, and I'll be handing the presentation, which is in agenda item 1C, which we can see here. I'll hand that over to Bev first, who will be giving us a brief update on those achievements and what's next. Then we'll be hearing from Angela, who's going to talk us through some of the major themes identified and the next steps. And Angela's also going to give us an overview of the current timetable. Then Angela will hand back to Tom, who will address the questions we posed for the board on page 5 of agenda item 1 in respect of the discussion paper. So thank you also to those board members who have already sent us written comments. We've heard from Imran, Sachiko, and Sue, and from some others. And of course, we'll take all of those into account in finalising the discussion paper. But that's actually it from me. So Bev, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Josephine, and hello, everyone. Firstly, I just want to address some of the comments that have come in offline where we've seen some themes, in particular the comment period. I think we've had some feedback with regard to the 60 days that we suggested. So I think before we start the call, we obviously need to rethink that. It was shorter perhaps than we intended. I think when we initially started writing this discussion paper, I think we'd hoped for something shorter. Once we started to get into it, we realized that it probably would be a bit more. And obviously there's some really meaty issues in there. So I think we will move to 120 days. So if we are putting the paper out at the end of August, that takes it to the end of December, which obviously people are off on their Christmas holidays. So we'll probably go slightly into the beginning of January. So it'll be slightly more than 120 days when we do issue the paper. The other area that we've got quite a lot of questions on is the questions, or sorry, comments on is the questions. And there've been some comments about that perhaps some of the questions are a little bit too narrow and too targeted. I think the questions, some of them, the ones in particular that are targeted and narrow, are based on some of the information within the discussion paper. They're sort of targeted at what we've heard. Remember that all the information in there is coming from all the different sources of information that we have. And those questions are targeted at those, but perhaps they are a little narrow and perhaps leading the witness a little bit. So we will have a look at some of those questions that are very targeted to perhaps make them a little bit more open, and also to allow for other things. So there may be something else that we haven't heard about that's not in the discussion paper that we want to include. So we will have a look at the questions, but obviously we couldn't get any further comments about the questions. We've received a couple offline, so thank you for that. But we will be re-looking a little bit more at the questions. Could I have the first slide, please? So just some context why we're doing this. So obviously with regard to fraud and going concern, we're hearing lots, there's lots being done in the environment. You can see in the discussion paper, we've set some of it out. But what we need to do as a board is work out exactly what it is that we need to do in relation to these two topics. So I think, as we all know, it was agreed in our framework for activities, we would do a lot more information gathering targeted at really trying to work out what our response will be to the issues. So Angela's done a lot of work around trying to gather together all the information that's out there with regard to going concern and fraud. We're still in the process of a couple of things. A lot of it is already done. However, we can really bucket the issues into two areas. The one is the areas where we know that there's issues. There's specific paragraphs within those two standards. We still obviously need to do some more work to work out what it is that we do around those, but we sort of know what the issues are. So some of the revenue recognition in the fraud standard, there's been questions around whether that needs to remain. So there are some very specific questions. I think Angela will go through some of those on the next slide. However, there are some issues and challenges that have been brought up where we need some more information. And this discussion paper is one of those areas. So there were three areas really where we worked out that there's more information needed. The one relates to the expectation gap, the one relates to technology, and the one relates to less complex entities. So what we've done is for the expectation gap, we thought that the best way to do it and to get a really broad feedback, because this really will drive the nature of what the projects are, we thought we would do this discussion paper targeted at that aspect. Off the back of that, we also will be holding a roundtable, which we're in the process of busy working on, trying to really focus on those that we don't ordinarily hear from and are unlikely to hear from in our discussion paper responses. So looking at audit committee members and chairs, looking at investors, preparers, sort of the other side that we don't normally hear from, because again, part of the expectation gap is coming from what people think auditors do. So we really do need to hear from them. So we're going to have that roundtable. And then on the other two, the technology and the fraud, the LCE, the same thing. We're going to have some roundtables to try and understand a little bit more about what the issues actually are. There's often, we'll hear that there's issues and challenges, but to be able to design an appropriate response as to what we're going to do, we probably need to understand a little more around that. Next slide, please. As usual, our coordination with the IASB is really important. So for both of these topics, obviously underlying everything that we do is an accounting framework. So we're auditing a set of financial statements, and there's an accounting framework that sits under that. So in particular, in relation to going concern, auditors can do what's in relation to the accounting framework. So we will continue our ongoing coordination with the IASB. We've already had some initial discussions with them to see whether they are hearing more in the current environment around going concern. And we will continue to have these discussions and coordination with the IASB where we do think that there are issues that are coming up that are related to the accounting framework. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's a really important aspect of both of these projects, is that we do continue to coordinate with them. So I think with that, you've got the discussion paper. Angela will now just talk a little bit more around some of the specific issues that we found within the work that she's been doing. Thanks, Angela.
Great, thank you, Bev. Yeah, so as Bev mentioned, I was able to take information from various sources that had fed through other IAASB projects, reviewed certain publications issued by other standard setters or other jurisdictions, reviews performed in other jurisdictions, and ultimately kind of compiled all of that information and identified some key themes. And like Bev mentioned, that sort of drove what we determined our next steps were in terms of targeted outreach and activities that we'll be performing. So if you can go to the next slide, please. I can just go through some of these themes that we identified. So the first one for fraud is just the overall expectation gap and clarification around the fundamental responsibilities of the auditor. And so that's what really led to the development of the discussion paper and some of the topics that are within the discussion paper. So some of these things, questions around whether forensic specialists should be involved to a greater required to a greater extent, procedures around non-material fraud, et cetera. Some of the main things that are sort of drawn out in the discussion paper were a result of comments that we had received from various other projects. And then, as Beth mentioned, kind of coming off the back of that, we'll be holding a roundtable discussion on September 28th. And that roundtable will really be focused on sort of the investor user population, those charged with governance, et cetera. So we're planning to, make sure that we're including those particular stakeholders, as well as public sector representatives, academics, some audit firm representation, and audit committee chairs, et cetera. So planning that now and making sure we're getting a global representation for that roundtable on September 28th. The second major theme, as Bev mentioned, is technology. So for that one, we're planning the technology-focused fraud roundtable, which will be held on September 2nd. So for that one, we've invited a range of stakeholders as well, including forensic specialists, financial statement auditors, public sector representation, audit methodology and technology experts from firms, third-party audit solutions, regulators, academics, and others. So I think that we'll have a good discussion on September 2nd and really get a good understanding of how is fraud being perpetrated through the use of technology, and how is technology being used within audits to identify areas with more fraud risk, as well as to actually, perform, fraud detection procedures in the audit. So will really help inform our understanding of the general technology landscape there. And then the third that Bev mentioned as well is the scope of procedures required for less complex entities. And so we're planning a roundtable for that as well, which will be the third in our series, which will be on October 7th. And then sort of going into that second bucket of items, which are the issues that we know about. We think they're, we need to have additional discussions about whether we need to address these, but we've kind of heard the issues, we know about it. We're going to take those to, a working group brainstorm in October to really discuss these and figure out how or if they should be addressed. And some of these are, for example, the rebuttable presumption of the significant risk of fraud in revenue recognition. We'd received quite a bit around journal entry testing. Perhaps people are interpreting the requirements differently, whether they're testing all journal entries or just one, or there's just a range of how people are interpreting those requirements. Additional fraud risks being called out in potentially the application material of the standard, better linkage to other ISAs, and clarification of procedures when fraud is identified. So that's to name a few, and we'll definitely take those to the working group and think about those issues a little bit more. If you can go to the next slide. So then similarly for going concern, the first major theme on that topic is the expectation gap and clarification of the fundamental responsibilities of the auditor relating to going concern. And so that overlap, seeing that those similar themes were coming up in our information gathering so far, we combined the two in the discussion paper and covered both fraud and going concern in the discussion paper, and we'll be including both topics in the roundtable discussion as well. And then the second item here are that sort of second bucket of items, the issues that we sort of know about. We're going to take them and explore them more within our working group brainstorm, which will be held in November for going concern. And some of these items were required communications with those charged with governance, better linkage to other ISAs, and specific acknowledgement of using work performed in other areas of the audit, sort of drawing that out a little bit more in the standard. Clarification between the difference between going concern and solvency and viability, so some different terms that are used in other jurisdictions. Clarification on what a material uncertainty is, and actually some of that is actually in the discussion paper as well. And then suggestions to add diagrams or whatnot to make the auditor reporting decisions clearer within the standard. If you can move to the next slide. And then here we just have a timetable of our planned activities. So, today we're discussing the discussion paper. We'll change this to a 120-day comment period here. And then this just shows that, the first two roundtables on technology and the expectation gap would be held in September. We have our fraud working group brainstorm and the LCE roundtable happening in October. And then we've got our going concern brainstorm discussion scheduled for November, all with the plan of providing the board with an update on the fraud project in December, and then an update on the going concern project in February. And then the project proposals are scheduled in Q2 for fraud, and then Q3 2021 for going concern. So before I hand back to Tom for the questions, I just wanted to check in to see, Bev, if you had anything to add on any of that.
Yeah, just the roundtable that we're having on the expectation gap at the end of September, on the 28th of September, also includes auditor reporting. So obviously you would all have seen that the survey has come out with regard to the post-implementation review. They also wanted to get some additional information from the same group that we're targeting for the roundtable. So I think we will be adding a session within that roundtable also on auditor reporting. And obviously the link between going concern and auditor reporting is very close. So it makes sense to add it on there. So we're working with the auditor reporting working group for that aspect of it. So there will be 3 topics going to that roundtable. Thanks, Angela.
Great, thank you. So Tom, I think at this time I can hand it back to you, and we can go to the next slide, which will go through the questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Angela. A couple of impressions that I take away from this, that it's really been helpful to have the beginnings of a framework of activities, which is focused the way we're setting up the projects and doing really tightly defined research and outreach, and to structure the way we're going through this. Secondly, is that this is still a very ambitious timeline, but I'd rather be ambitious and see if we can make it and be changed by events. But I think it's worth topics of this high priority. It's worth us sort of going at full speed. And so thank you for pushing yourselves, both Bev and Angela. And finally, that we are trying our hardest to get broad input on this, not just from practitioners, but from a wide range of stakeholders who have an interest in these topics. So thank you for pursuing that with our roundtables, and we'll depend upon board members to push to participation in our discussion paper, comment period, and everything like that. But it's really important that we get a real diversity of input for these couple of topics as we go ahead. Okay, so we're going to sort of switch this up a little bit. We thought yesterday a little bit about how most effective to get comment on it, and we'll break it up, as this slide says, into views on the content of the document. And please, if it's editorial, that all could go to Bev and Angela. We're really focused on the substance of the content. And is there anything that you would have expected in the document that's not there, or that we should be getting views on? So that corresponds to questions 1A, B, and 2A of the issue paper. The second thing would be questions on the questions, or comments on the questions in the invitation. And Bev gave you a little bit of background on some of the topics that we've heard on that, and the balance that we're trying to get right. That would be question 1C of the issues paper. And then finally, the agreement of the board to go ahead, subject to sub-quality control and final sign-offs by Fiona and me and the task force, the work group chair, on for this document, so we could get it out and get comment as soon as possible. That would be question 2B. We'll reserve. My assumption is that people will be fine with the extension of comment period. But if you want to raise an issue on the comment period, it's in that final question, that third question. And then, of course, we could do any other, a fourth area of any other matters related to the discussion paper and our consultations on these two topics. Does that sound like a plan? Good. We're going to go ahead. So let's open it up to comments on the content of the document. This corresponds to questions 1A, B, and 2A in the issue paper. Anyone wants to start us off? I'll cold call on people too. Okay, Isabel.
Hello, everybody. Hello from the French Alps. I thought it was a very good document, even if already quite long, if we want to get some focused feedback. And maybe we can remove some duplications, especially around the topic of expectation gap. I believe sometimes we have the same thing that is in written and that is in the graphs. So maybe we can streamline that. But these are really detailed. What I was missing was maybe a conceptual step between the big picture we're trying to give and the proposed solutions we are proposing for comments. And thinking to that, I was missing maybe a step, a conceptual step, where we would categorize the proposed solution. And I was thinking to a 3-point step. The first question would be around the concepts of fraud and going concern. And the question should be something like, should we change, amend, modify the concepts of fraud and going concern. And so, then some of the proposals are around that thing, changing or modifying the concept of the definition. Then the second point for me would be, should we change, amend, modify the procedures to be performed? And then the third step would be, should we change, amend, modify the reporting? So we would have the concept and the definition, then the procedures, and then the reporting. And if we look at the procedures, we can ask ourselves, should we perform the same procedures than the one we perform today, but differently? Like your example of including a specialist. It's still the same procedures, but we would have an additional expertise in the performance. And the second sub-question of modification of the procedures would be, should we do different or additional procedures, which is something different than performing the same procedures differently. And then in my third point, which is, should we change, amend, or modify the reporting? We can first have a look at the existing communications that we have. We have the existing communication to who's charged with governance, and we have the audit report. And so we can think to add more communication to who's charged with governance, or to amend the auditor's report as it is today to put more around the concept of fraud or going concern. And then the last sub-question of the reporting would be, should we create a new communication tool or a new report around the topic of fraud and going concern? And if so, to whom? And what would be the content? So that was my try to have a conceptual layer between the big picture and all the proposed solutions that we are bringing for comments to the respondents. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. I guess the one reaction I have to that, and maybe it's just a language issue, is that we're not actually proposing any specific solutions here, though. Another way to think about it, though, to bridge your comments, is should we be highlighting those as options for people to comment on and draw them out? And obviously we'll return to that issue when we sum everything up. So thank you, Isabel. Julie?
Thanks, Tom. And just to add my congratulations to Angela and Bev and others on the paper. I think it was really well done. Just one thing that struck me when I was reading it, and I don't know if the group had considered it, but I wonder if we're missing a bit of an opportunity in this paper to emphasize the totality of the financial reporting ecosystem. And what I mean by that is, we talk a lot about the auditor. I know that's the focus of the paper. There are places in the paper we talk about what the entity's responsibilities are and management's responsibilities, but there's also a big role for those charged with governance or audit committees to play. And I just wondered if there was an opportunity maybe just to emphasize that a little bit more and describe that sort of the three working in concert, and that they all need to work together, particularly on topics like this. I think it's really important to draw that out. So that was just the one thing that I thought maybe we could emphasize a little bit more in the paper. That's all. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Julie. Chun-Li?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to Angela, Bev, and Josephine. I think this paper is in a very good place. So congratulations on all the great work, great job done so far. I do have a few comments that I want to share, maybe just 4 broad points. I have some detailed drafting suggestions, which I'll send through. I won't mention this, but I'll send through to Bev after I tidy them up a little bit. So first comment is actually on the title, actually the subtitle. The subtitle is exploring difference between public perceptions about role of auditor and the auditor's obligations. So first of all, needless to say, I'm very supportive of the decision to use the ACCA 3 components to expectation gap to help structure the conversation. I've used it myself. I think it's a very sensible and helpful framework. A first look at this subtitle, though, it feels like our focus is entirely on the knowledge gap, because we're talking about perception versus what auditors are supposed to do. And we know that this is often being perceived as a lazy excuse by the profession not to do anything. and it's not constructive, and it's really not doing justice to the content of the discussion paper, which focuses a lot on the evolution gap. So I would suggest that we reconsider this subtitle, but of course, at the same time, be careful that we don't overpromise because we're at a very preliminary information collection stage. So that's my first comment on the subtitle. If I can move on to the table, which is page 7 for me, where we show examples of the various components of expectation gap. So to the right of the performance gap, where we talk about what others have contributed in terms of expectation gap. And I agree with all the points listed, training, audit quality, tight deadlines. I'm quite keen though that we don't let the readers walk away thinking that we are not doing anything about these from a standard setting perspective, because we are, through what will hopefully be approved very soon, the Quality Management Suite of Standards. So I wonder if we can just say something in the footnote, maybe to that effect. Also in the same column, and maybe this is similar to Julie's point, on performance gap, I wonder if this is the right place to make reference to the role played by others, for example, audit committees. And as Julie mentioned, and as we all know, audit committee plays a very important role as an interface between external auditors and management. So we often hear that some AC are not as effective as they could be. So I wonder if we could just make some general point in this column. But otherwise, I support Julie's point that we can talk more about that ecosystem somewhere within the discussion paper. My third quick comment, the part where we talk about the possible enhanced quality control requirements, and reference is made to the Japanese fraud standard that were put in place back in 2013. I think the readers of the discussion papers, those of us who are not from Japan, will be quite interested to know how the Japanese experience has been, given that it's been a few years since it was implemented, how effective it has been, any challenges, lesson learned, as we consider a similar approach. So we are not expecting a full narration, but maybe one or two liner just to provide a flavor. My last quick point, Appendix B, under Alternative B, is not obvious to me how item 3 is different from number 2. I thought that the purpose of risk assessment procedures is to assess risk based on understanding of the facts and circumstances of the engagement. So I can't really tell them apart. So I would urge us to have a look at that again. So that will be my comments for now. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Chong. Eric?
Thanks, Tom, and very supportive of moving this project forward. In Canada, a number of stakeholders have been working together on fraud and going concern matters for a number of months now, involving practitioners, standard setters, regulators, and so on. And one of the starting points was the thematic reviews that the audit inspectors had carried out, where they had looked at the compliance with the current standards. And they were finding that auditors, or certainly the files they looked at, were in compliance with the standards, but they did want to explore whether auditors should be doing more. And so they formed a couple of working groups, kind of like you've done, to review that. And I think and the work is ongoing, and so I'm kind of giving my personal views here. But basically, the preliminary assessment they've come to so far is that this needs to really focus on all of the different stakeholders that have a role to play in the financial reporting process. That by starting looking at specifically issues with the standards, it's difficult to understand whether this will really have any impact on the expectation gap. And it's interesting that I took the time to read some of the Australian report. And Roger, I'm sure you know this off by heart. it said the relative responsibilities of directors and management versus those of auditors in these areas are often misconstrued, and the outcomes achievable by an audit overestimated. And so they go on to say that it needs to take into account the whole ecosystem of corporate governance and financial reporting, as well as the cost. And so, in my view, this discussion paper should not be focusing in on the very detailed audit procedural steps that the working group is going to consider not independently, but separately later this year. And because I think the expectation gap should be around what are the roles of the different players with respect to fraud and going concern, and where do auditors fit into that? And so I found the questions that were being posed, which get into a lot of those procedures, will be very difficult to answer when the focus of your round table is on investors, audit committee members, and so on. They will not understand some of those technical nuances. So I had some pretty significant concerns about the approach to the paper and the questions that were being asked. And of course, when it was a 60-day comment period, that was even more frightening to me. But I think that it's important to keep moving. It's important to be fast, but it's important to take the appropriate time to really understand what is the appropriate roles of everyone with respect to these matters, and then look back on how could the auditing standards respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I'm gonna grab Sue and then pause for a moment after Sue to see if any Bev or Josephine want to respond, and then we'll keep going. There's lots of hands up now.
Thanks, Tom. So similar to Julie and Chun-Wei, I had the point about the financial reporting ecosystem and the responsibilities. In addition to the stakeholders that have been mentioned, I also highlighted the role of the regulators, because they often act as or have an opportunity to interface with both audit committees as well as auditors. Similar to Chun-Wei, a question about whether there was any feedback that could be quoted regarding the effectiveness of the actions that have been taken, actually both in Japan and also in the European Union. Those actions are quoted in the paper. And there's several sections where it references suspicious mindset, looking at things in a negative light. And I wondered whether there was any kind of academic research or anything like that around psychology and behavioural aspects of the best ways of getting challenging information from people, because these seem to come with a sort of predisposed action, whereas there are different ways of achieving the same goal. So I just wondered whether there was more backup that we could look at there. I've sent some comments offline, and I should have started by saying thank you to the group, because I think there's an awful lot there, and it's it will prompt some good discussions. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to pause. You don't need to respond to anything yet, Bev or Josephine or Angela, but I'm happy, just as a sort of an intermission in this round, to let you in. We have heard this theme about the ecosystem, which by drawing that out, actually you may then allow some of Eric's more strategic desire to get a higher level strategic discussion about roles and responsibilities in the system out there. So that may be one way to deal with Eric's issue. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think we obviously need to put more about the whole ecosystem. So we'll have a look about how we can build that in, including the regulators as well. With regard to Japan, we actually have had a call with Sachiko to talk through what the changes were and sort of what they were seeing. We need to go back to that conversation and see if we can pull any notes, but it is very difficult to work out what the direct impact is and sort of quote that. But we'll work with Sachiko to see if we can perhaps just talk a little bit more around what they've seen the outcomes are. I think obviously there'll be some different inspection findings, but I'm not sure that fraud is completely stopped in Japan because of what they've done. So there, again, there's other factors that also lead to some of these things. So we can add a little bit more just to give a flavor of what's happened. And then the European Union will have a look at that as well. And then with regard to the suspicious mindset, we do have a lot of academic research. I think Angela's gone through over 100 papers of academic research on this topic. We'll see if we can perhaps pull a little bit more out around the suspicious mindset and different things that perhaps can be done. When you look at the topic of fraud in the academic world, it's very, very broad. So we've tried to narrow it, but we may need to do a little bit more work then on that particular area. So I think just this paper was particularly hard to write because there's a balance of what we can do and what others can do. And we've tried to bring out a flavor of what others can do. Perhaps we haven't brought that out quite clearly enough to sort of get a little bit more of that balance that perhaps Eric's looking for, and that there's other players in the ecosystem. Again, this is to gather information. I'm not sure that when we get to the end of this, we'll be done and we can just start standard setting. I think what we may find from this and from listening to your comments is that we may actually need to go out and do more work and look more broadly at the whole ecosystem while we do certain things in the background. So the whole purpose of this is really to understand what the issues actually are. And I fully understand that the auditing standards are only a very small piece of the puzzle. But I think part of this is also educational. So it's to try and bring this to the fore and into the global discussions that there are issues, and it's not just for the auditors to fix, and the standard setters themselves play a very small part, but we will play our part, but we also need to drive others to play their part. But again, I think that's a bit of a journey. I don't think we can fix that with one discussion paper and have that discussion just through this discussion paper. I think we'll need to work through that as we sort of progress on this journey. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Bev. Okay, we're going to do back-to-back Kais. We're going to start with Kai-Uwe first.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon from Germany. My view is that the paper is very well done. I have only some brief comments. There's a main issue which I'm missing from my point of view in relation to fraud, because there's a systemic treatment of the inherent limitation of an audit. Very similar to Isabel, the inherent limitation of an audit are discussed for going concern, but not for fraud. The main inherent limitations regarding fraud relate to the fact that auditors do not have the powers of the courts, the police, and public prosecutors to seize documents and electronic files and question individuals on the case. There are some more comments in this field, and I will send them offline. The next point which I want to raise is that the draft is sufficiently clear and understandable. However, some of the questions need to be augmented for the consideration of costs and benefits and the inherent limitation of an audit, as I have mentioned. The treatment of the expectation gap is incomplete in my view, without adding what some academics in this field term the reasonableness gap. That is the gap between what the public would like to have auditors do beyond current auditing standard and what auditors are capable of doing even if auditing standards are changed. The reasonableness gap is caused by the inherent limitation of the audits, including but not limited to time and cost versus benefits. That's my comment. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Kai. Kai Morton.
Thank you, Tom. And first, congratulations to Angela and Beverly on a very well written and good document. I think it's a very good discussion paper. The one thing though is that who's the intended audience of the paper? When I read it from a practitioner point of view or standard setter point of view, they know the background. But if we are seeking input from other users, similar to what others have commented, I think we're going in at the level is too low, too detailed, so that it's more, we need to get in more at a higher level to the higher discussion as Eric alluded to. I think also supporting Julie and Changwei's ecosystem, that we need to explain a little bit more on the role of others, but it's difficult though, so that this does not become like a defensive paper of why auditors are doing the right thing today and trying to explain all the failures by the expectation gap or performance gap in a way that we're not really talking about that much, but that should be addressed by the quality standards. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Lynn with a Y.
Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon or morning. I thought the paper was a good read and will give a valuable contribution to the projects going forward. Like others, I had a problem with the ecosystem being missing, and I wondered if a diagram right up front with the ecosystem, with our little bit of the pie sticking out of it, might be a way to diagrammatically show that ecosystem, and that what we're concentrating on is that wee bit of the pie. Most of my comments are on the questions, so I'll wait till the next round for those. The only other thing I had on the paper, you asked for if there were any omissions, and we wondered whether going concern regarding interim review engagements was going to be a part of this or not. I know it's a standard that hasn't been updated and is on our list, but it seemed to us an obvious omission. So that's all I have on the paper, but I do have questions and comments on the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yosh?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for working groups. And I agree with the Chan and the jury. Just before one comment from the Japanese FSA, if I could ask an additional favor, I would like to include a hyperlink to the English version in discussion paper. It's not, it's we cannot find a hyperlink in the discussion paper about the Japanese auditing standards for fraud. So it's from promotion from Japanese FSA, please. And the next, just one next point is, I agree with the requiring the use of forensic specific specialists to respond to the fraud at a specific stage of audit engagement. In addition, I would like the working group to consider the requirement to strengthen the coordination between auditors and charged with governance when the auditor identifies any signs of frauds. It should be more than 260, I think. Since the compliance is one of the company's internal control objectives, the issue of the cost for using such forensic specialists is taken by the company, not by the auditors. Thank you.
Thank you. Rich?
Thanks, Tom. So maybe to start off, I support this project, support the DP as a way of getting further information, and especially I like the idea of the roundtable outreach that we're planning. Maybe I start to thank the group who put the papers together. Clearly, a lot of work has been put into these documents. I do have comments that I'll send separately after the call. Similar to others, I think the main thing I'm missing is, what really to take away from this. To me, I'm missing the emphasis up front that this is a much broader issue than just making some changes to ISO 240 and ISO 570. But it's a broader picture that we need to input on, and a broader solution that we need to be thinking about. The IAASB can obviously play a major role in addressing the issue, needs to play a major role, but it's not limited just to standard setting activities. I think the important is that DP conveys this role and what the IAASB can do to further debate and wider challenges, and of course, what it can do to improve its standards to reflect these concerns. But I really do support what others, especially Julie, Eric, and Chen-Wei said about the ecosystem. I think it's a much broader setting that we need to be thinking about all of these responses in. As a little side note, I also, I know people have added, maybe we should have the regulators in, which I agree. It'd be a little more challenging. I wonder whether we should be reaching out even further and looking towards politicians. If you think about the sound bites that we hear when something goes wrong, it's usually a major politician or the G20 making a statement about what auditors should do. If we want to understand what those comments are and sway them into thinking that we have a response that we can do, I think we need to get them up front and engaged in the topic. As we talked about and others have mentioned, what we need to be sure that we deal with is also how we play, but how others play in this role, and especially I think the IASB has a major role in this. We've had this discussion in the past. I know Arnold was on this topic every time we went to go see the IASB, that we believe that their influence and their standards on how to deal with going concern, interplay very much on how we as auditors can take a topic further. So I do really much think that we need to be highlighting their role of the IASB as a very critical element of this. Like Eric and others, I think the paper shouldn't convey a narrow standard setting focus, but give the impression that the board has, or give the impression that the board has already concluded on what changes or what types of changes that can be done. And if you think about some of the stuff that Isabel talked about, well, I might categorize them differently. I like the idea of trying to take it from a big picture approach and not just here's individual things that might be done. To that point, I'd also would say, we talked about one of the previous slides about the brainstorming sessions, and I know this throws a wrench into the whole machinery, but I almost wonder whether those brainstorming sessions would be better done prior to the discussion paper going out, so that you actually have a better understanding of what's out there, at least from a board perspective. This positioning of looking at it from an ecosystem perspective, a broader perspective might be best placed in the chair's forward or the introduction section. Again, to me, I think if this is perceived too narrowly, then we're not going to do much to change the expectation gap and not be seen to be actually solving the problem. Lastly, on this part, I would just say, we did have a similar situation with the LCE. If you remember, we did a discussion paper. We tried to rush it through the March board session, say we're going to get it right out. And rightfully at that time, the board said getting the discussion paper through on one shot was not the right way. We brought it back, had another discussion, and more importantly, broadened the request that we were asking for. So not just to say, here are 3 answers, give us the answers to these. I don't think we have the answers to this. The other topic you said on question, I guess 2A, I wonder whether it's right. We put in the ACCA guidance on the expectation gap. And I read that and reread that. And, the problem, I think it's a good way to look at it, but I'm not sure, we as a group have not talked about this. And I, for one, do not believe that the discussion of performance gap as illustrated is maybe correct. I think there is an element of performance gap that's relevant to the expectation gap, where standards are ambiguous, maybe resulting in inconsistent practice. But where the standards are clear and the auditors just don't do what they're required to do, I don't believe that's expectation gap. I think that's just, they did not execute properly. So if we're going to keep the 3-part structure, and like I said, there are some relevant reasons why to do that. I do think we need to clarify that in the document. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Rich. Roger?
Yeah, congratulations to Angela, Bev and the team. Look, I think it's a very good document. I do accept the ecosystem comments, and I think it could be used as a scoping mechanism. We're all looking for where to put it, somewhere in the background information. I think it would help to go into the background information. And I like Lynn's idea of scoping it so that you can see. We know there's many parties involved in reducing the expectations gap, and we know we're focusing, we need to deal with all those particular parties. I think you've done a very good job of pulling a lot of diverse information together. I can see the academic literature, how it's been pulled together. I think that's been done very well. I think that we've pulled together just about every possible permutation and combination of the expectations gap. So that's not an area I would be looking at expanding it upon. But I think you've done a good job. I understand the public interest in trying to get this out in these 2 particular areas. But the only thing I would be pressing is probably a little bit more scoping around the ecosystem, which you've already agreed is an approach way forward. So, but apart from that, I'm very satisfied.
Thank you. So again, taking the ecosystem theme is coming through loud and clear for us, and I think that is not a huge change in the document, but is an appropriate contextual thing, which would lead to some questions that would follow naturally in the document. I don't know if, Bev, you want to respond to any of the more specific comments right now. Ultimately, we'll have to determine whether we want to issue a document now with some scoping changes and questioning with an idea that it's important to initiate the discussion, and therefore that the document is in reasonable shape with some improvements based upon input here, that we don't need another discussion, or we need to come back to the board. And that will keep that in the back of your mind, whether because we'll come to that in our 3rd part of this discussion today. Bev, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. And a couple on the more detailed comments. Lynn, with regard to the interim reviews, I haven't left them out on purpose. We will have a look if we can just mention them. I think the intention is that we fully know that there's issues there. We want to try speed up a project on 2410, we understand that, but it probably falls out the remit of this paper, but maybe we can just allude to it so that people don't think we've forgotten about it, because it is a big issue. Yosh, we will hyperlink to the English version of the Japanese standards. And then Rich, we'll just have a look at how we've described the expectation gap. It's a very hard one. And, you know, at one point when we first started writing this, I think Angela and I had a long conversation about whether we call it the expectation gap, because there's lots of different ways that people see this and they understand different things by it. And I think that's what we've tried to bring out there. And we've got some couching language up front, but we'll have a look at that to say, this is one way of looking at it. It's not necessarily our way, but it kind of describes the different things. But we will have a look at the specific words that you highlighted with regard to the firms and them not doing the work. It's where it's just not perhaps part of the expectation gap. So perhaps we'll just soften some of that. And I think, and then it's obviously around the expectation gap. I have some ideas how we can make it a bit broader up front, and sort of give more of the sphere of what we're looking at here, and that we're looking at one part of this ecosystem. I quite like what Lynn said, because a diagram always really explains things well. So perhaps we can think about doing something like that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess the other thing I'm reminded of is, while we talk about the ecosystem, I'm also realistic, is that in this ecosystem, we only have certain powers. And so at the end of the day, we have to conclude is what we can do in our standard setting function to address any of the issues that we think are appropriate to be addressed. There's some, like corporate governance issues we could raise, but some of them will be just out of our control. So we'll just have to be realistic too, as well. Our role in this may be a little bit about raising the issues, but managing expectations about what's realistic for an audit standard setter to do in this context. Len.
Thank you, Tom. Hope my connection is working today. Thank you very much for Angela and Bev for the work for the paper. A lot of good information, very supportive of the project. I'm based in a jurisdiction and also my region. A lot of fraud often not surface to English press. So a lot of things you guys probably would never heard, but fraud is definitely a hot topic. Agree on a lot of comments, so I don't want to repeat them for the sake of time, but a couple of things. I think Sue and Rich talk about regulators. I think when we talk about expectation gap, there's also expectation gap amongst the regulators. I think when you talk to prudential regulator, capital market regulator, and audit regulators, the expectation of auditors' roles and responsibility in fraud sometimes may not be on the same page. So, I'm not sure in terms of stage of getting invitation to the panelists for a roundtable. I think we need to do more work and get more regulatory input, not just from one set of regulators. On the expectation gap, one particular questions I have is on page 8 and the evolution gap. The third bullet, the way it's written, is talks about users are looking for more assurance. So when you say more assurance in relation to fraud and going concern, that's currently not provided in the requirements of the standards. I just want to be clear, we're not opening a can of worms, because when you say more assurance, are we talking about challenging the current audit assurance framework? I'm not sure people will understand that, because the expectation gap often result from people don't know exactly what's the assurance framework for audit. I mean, this is a technical term, and when we go out with the document, I think we have to be very careful in terms of, if we are going to think about, maybe because the evolution is more expectation for auditors should do, but are we willing to look at the assurance framework as part of the project? And also kind of related is page 11, when we introduce the idea of requiring a forensic specialist. I think that's something I think also probably need to give more thoughts, because that's in the evolution gap. Perhaps I've been working with forensic specialists, at least a different part of service from audit. I mean, they do different things. There's a different expectation in terms of what the forensics auditors do versus the financial statement auditors do. So when we go out with example, possible changes in ISO 240 about requiring forensic specialists, I just want to be very careful what we're talking about. So just to keep my comments short, agree with the ecosystem and other stuff, but the evolution gap in terms of use of the forensic in this example, and also when we talk about more assurance, we just want to be very, very careful in terms of what we're trying to do. What's the expectation there? Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Jim Dalkin.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you for the paper. I thought it was put together well. I think it outlined the expectation gap well and brought up somewhat of the background. Two thoughts, and this has been a very significant issue for the CAG, and there's been a lot of support to look into the fraud and going concern. So thank you for doing that. One is and maybe this fits in the ecosystem comment, is to have a step back and look at some of the pretty significant frauds that have occurred in the last couple of years, and to see ultimately, once you get to the point of executing procedures, what may work, what may be done that's not currently being done. And then the second, and I always have to bring this up, but I think it is really different this time, is public sector. A lot of the fraud in the public sector, it's different than what you would typically find in commercial, because you don't find much in terms of presumption of revenue type of fraud. So I know you're going to speak to a number of different groups, but you may want to be sure to do that because of the uniquenesses. Thanks.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom, and also thanks to the whole team because of the nice way the paper was prepared. In reality, fraud and going concern are really quite complex items that we need to deal every day in audits, and the paper really summarizes in 20 pages 2 items that are really difficult and hard to understand. I think the paper really walks you through each one of the items in a way that sets the path for the questions. Good summary, good themes. I think that the only probably word of caution at the end when the paper is finalized, let's make sure that it does not give the impression that we as a board have committed to make some of the changes or to respond to every one of the items that we have here. I think that this could be a risk, because instead of really reducing the expectation gap, it could be the other way around. If people tend to think that every one of the items that are being discussed here will be tackled or resolved in a certain way. Thanks.
Fernando, that comment responds to the point that I raised earlier, but I think it's an excellent one. When we talk about the ecosystem, I think we have to be clear what our role, particularly, and what we can affect on our own in any discussion document. And this goes to some of Isabel's points at the outset about what are the options ahead of us and what's possible. So really good insights there. Sachiko?
Hello, everybody. I think this discussion paper is a good document to start conversation with stakeholders about our fraud and going concern project. And I also support clarification about financial reporting ecosystem in balanced way. And I also very much support what Fernando said right now. And with regard to the description Japanese fraud standard around quality control, I think Yoshi's idea is good. And I am also very happy to work with Bev to think about whether we can add some more flavor in the description itself in the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Tashka. Imran.
Chairman, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So pleased to see all the IAASB board members still so healthy despite the challenges we face. Tom, I provided a 2-page long set of written comments about the paper last week. Therefore, I'm going to keep my comments at the highest possible level. I really want to say that the publication of this discussion paper is the fulfillment of the promise we made in the strategy which we published earlier this year. And thanks and acknowledgement must go to your leadership and the entire drafting team and everybody who worked on this. This is a discussion paper. It's not the last word on the topic, and it's neither everything to do with the first word. We're going to hear a lot more about it in the roundtables and through the surveys that we do and other research. And I think that in the nature of a discussion paper, we're not going to get it all down now, but we should try to get it out to the market as quickly as we can. I like also that the recognition of us prioritizing this, Tom, is because some of us who are at the front line of regulating and setting standards face very challenging questions being asked about us about confidence and trust in audits. Auditors say, we're doing what the standards ask of us. There's nothing more we can do. Look at the standard setters. Tom, that's you and I and the people around this table. Those who have reached the end of the road say we need to look to the IAASB. And I agree that there's a role that others can play, but they need to do what they need to do. We need to explore our role to the fullest, as quickly and as responsibly as you're guiding us at the moment, so that we continue to keep the audit product relevant, and that the reputation of the board about being a trendsetter and a protector of the public interest in this area is maintained. So really that just an overall really strong steer. There are detailed comments in my notes. None of it is truly critical. I've heard many positive things about this, but really happy to see the discussion paper out as quickly as possible and much board resources attached to this. The one comment that I've pointed out in my written remarks 3 times was the perspective that James raised briefly, but I raised in much more detail on public sector considerations. And I provided some examples of where I think the public sector examples can be explored in greater detail. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Imran. Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and apologies. I had a technology glitch here and I dropped off and realized my hand wasn't raised any longer. But for the sake of brevity, I just want to echo the entire discussion around the ecosystem. So I won't go any further with that, other than to say, I think picking up on comment that Bev had about the discussion that her and Angela had about even using the term expectation gap. I think we probably crossed that bridge and getting there. But I think, one thing that we do need to be careful of, and it comes through a little bit in the drafting of the paper, is that you almost can set another expectation gap when you talk about what you can do to address the expectation gap currently. So people just think that you've got a magic bullet. So that's where the ecosystem comment comes in. The other thing that I'll just quickly add, and I wanted to support Rich on, we haven't had a lot of discussion around the going concern topic, but I share Rich's view that the critical role that the accounting framework or the accounting standard setters play in that equation, to a large extent, the auditor audits what the accounting framework requires the preparer to present. So I think we need to be sure that we draw that out and are consulting and working with the IASB on those areas with respect to going concern. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks. Of course, that latter topic, we're in very close contact with the IASB. Of course, they have their own agenda review processes as well. And so the question is we're their priorities fall relative to ours, but clearly if stakeholders come back and identify that issue, we will certainly be sharing that information with the IASB, and hopefully we'll both prioritize in an aligned way. But we know the challenges of two independent boards working with each other, with our good colleagues at Iasb as well. So I think we should be very clear, going back to an earlier comment about the ecosystem, what we control, what our dependencies are on, and we could draw that out slightly more in the next iteration. But to me, I've seen general support for the content of it, with some really good guidance about raising it a level from an ecosystem, some pointed areas to be fixed in the next rounds. But largely people are supportive of the direction of the content, which was the purpose of this discussion right now. Bev, Angela, Josephine, any other comments on the content comments you received?
I'll just come in on one or two. The one is Len brought up the forensic auditors and what they do versus what auditors do. And I think it's a really, really important point, because everybody keeps, or what we've read and what we hear is that people are looking for more forensic type procedures in an audit. And I think they're done for different objectives. The procedures are different. So what we need to do, and we'd already thought about this a little bit, in particular at the round table where we've got the forensic specialists as well, is to try and draw out what that difference is and that they're done for different purposes. But perhaps we just need a little bit more of a flavor of that within the discussion paper. And then very much the public sector. So I will look throughout the paper to see where we can perhaps draw out a little bit more about the differences in the public sector. They do some of these sections perhaps a little bit better than private sector auditors. Well, not better, but more robustly. For example, in fraud, some of their procedures are different. And then again, they'd have different procedures for going concern, because they see going concern in a very different way to the way private sector auditors do. And perhaps we just need to bring a little bit of that out within this paper. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Should we move to the questions being asked?
Can I say something?
Yes, Marcus, I didn't know if you were clapping or raising your hand. I got a clap earlier, but go ahead, Marcus.
Yeah, sorry, I cannot raise my hand. I can only clap, it seems like. But on the topic, shortly on the fraud discussion, one issue we have as PIOB is that the discussion paper is very technical and directed at auditors. And I guess at this stage, you said you want to reach a broader audience. So basically, there is some misconception if I go very technical, which I cannot assume that everybody of the stakeholders is aware. And the second one on going concern, this is not a new one. It came up before with the auditor reporting, and it was going back and forth between IASB and IAASB. And so I realize, or the PIOB realizes the difficulties, but in the end, if you take it up, there should be somebody responsible for a solution, and it should not end nowhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Your point, I think, on non-technical people was echoed earlier too in the discussion, and some of that is the ecosystem. The other thing I should say too is this won't be the only means of communication with the non-technical folks, and precisely one of the rationales for the roundtable, and maybe we have to think about a little bit better, is what high-level document, maybe it's a couple of pages, to prepare people for the roundtable, so they don't have to read the discussion paper in its full technical detail, and so that they have something like a briefing note that will prepare them sufficiently for an informed discussion that's not really technical at a roundtable level. So point taken on the paper too, but I'm just wondering whether that leads to our approach, which isn't all dependent upon the discussion paper. The discussion paper is getting input for probably a certain community. Roundtables are meant to diversify that community as well, but point noted. Okay, Bev, anything more you want on the content side?
No, I think we had intended to do something for the roundtables in addition to the discussion paper, just to set the participants up. We've already done one for the fraud because obviously there's very little context for that one. This discussion paper won't be out until roughly when that roundtable is. So we will take in the comments that we need to keep it at a much higher level, but we still will look throughout the paper and at sort of, we had some various comments throughout the board comments about the very technical nature. So we'll just have a look at that and see if we can soften a little bit of that in the paper as well.
Yeah, okay. Josephine, I see your hands raised.
Yes, just to add, I wonder as well what we could do before we send, or when we send out the discussion paper, is we could have a short podcast or video clip that actually does exactly what you're saying, has that sort of 2-page summary of what's in the discussion paper, what we're trying to achieve as well. So people look at that before they open the discussion paper. That might also help bridge the gap between those who are not particularly technical, but yet we still want their feedback, particularly around some of these more broader questions, and especially around questions around the accounting framework as well, because that is information we can feed back to the IASB if we get that evidence, and they'll be looking for that evidence from us as well as their own stakeholders.
All right, great. Okay, so that was really rich feedback there, so thank you, everyone. We're going to go to the question on the questions here. As I said, some of it will naturally follow, particularly all that ecosystem discussion, the types of questions that should come from that. But I know, Lynn, was it you who said that you had some particular comments? So maybe we start with you and then invite others to comment on the questions.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I started by reading the questions because I thought if somebody's giving me a survey, I'll read the questions and then I'd read the discussion document. And my first question was the one that Kai Morden asked: who is the audience that can answer these questions? And when I went back to the discussion paper and found it was a very broad audience, I thought, boy, these are really technical, detailed questions. And I'm not sure that too many investors or audit committee people would have any show at all of answering them. And I sit on half a dozen audit and risk committees, so I know the people that sit on these kind of committees, and I think I could count on my thumbs the number of people that could actually answer these. And these are not silly people or anything else, they are competent people, but they don't have this level of technical knowledge. So I wondered, in terms of the questions, whether we need a set for them for the non-auditors as well as one for the auditors. And I particularly in 1 and 2, so that was my first point. My second point is, and concentrating on questions 1 and 2, I think the discussion we've had around the expectation gap and the ecosystem is reflected at a very technical level in those 2 questions, and I think it should be at more of a general level. My next comment relates to, and I think somebody's alluded to this as well, once we set out a question or once we raise an expectation, I think there has to be a reasonable chance of it having some legs or some credibility. And on question 4, I'm really concerned that we might be setting up auditing to find non-material errors, and just because it's fraud, that could relate through into the whole financial statements, and that makes auditing not only difficult but actually impossible to do on any cost benefit or time benefit basis. My final two comments are, if we're doing a survey, it irritates me if I can't go backwards and forwards, and these questions are quite iterative in places. So making sure that we have the ability to go backwards and forwards. And finally, it would be useful if any, if it's a survey and there's not going to be letters, I think a lot of jurisdictions are doing work in this area and would really like the detail of the feedback. So making that publicly available and transparent to people, I think would be valuable, or at least for their jurisdiction, what feedback comes back. And our national standard setter is certainly happy to prompt and help people to do the survey so we get good feedback. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. I just think we'll get a couple clarifications here from Billy or Bev from a process standpoint. My understanding is that we have in the past done separate sets of targeted questions for different communities. So we certainly have a precedent there. And two was the question of survey versus comment letters. What can you explain our thinking on that, Bev and Billy?
Yes, I think I've got a much greater appreciation for the interest in this topic. I think a survey is not really going to cut it at this point. So I think we'll definitely move towards letters. And I think as soon as we started talking about the 60-day, because to me, when we originally started writing it, and maybe we've added a lot more context in here than perhaps we'd originally intended. It was meant to be a short discussion paper with a short period in a survey format. But as we kind of delved into it a little bit more, I think more and more has been coming out, and this call in particular has really shown me how much interest there is. So I think we extended the period, and we moved to more of a letter format, because I think that there is a lot of interest and there's a lot to say. I'm not sure you could capture that in a survey. So I think we'll just make some of those adjustments going through. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Billy?
Just to Bev's point, we did actually reflect a little bit on this yesterday afternoon already. So I think the move to the discussion paper is, the comment letters is a good one. And yes, I mean, most recently in the auditor reporting post-implementation review survey, we've got different questions for different groups. So that's certainly possible.
Okay, thank you for those clarifications. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom. I'm glad I come after Lean and all those discussions, because that's the exact point I was going to raise. I think the issue is that the question were really formulated with the traditional respondents in mind. And I really just can't imagine those other respondents, how are they going to respond to that? So I'll not waste more ad time. I just want to support what's been said, and I will support us developing potentially a separate set of questions for those stakeholders, and maybe the way we get responses from those and inputs from them wouldn't be through a very formalized survey or comment letter, but the roundtable that we've had. But one roundtable is clearly not enough. I think we need to actively reach out to those interest groups and representative groups like the ICGN, CFA institutes, etc. I was looking at ICGN's website, for example, and see that they have a virtual global conference coming up in early November. So as we reach out to them, firstly to encourage them to respond as an organization, but also to encourage them to reach out to their members to respond to our consultation, I think we could discuss potentially using their conference as a platform to do further dissemination of information and collection of inputs. So something that I'll encourage us to do. Thanks.
Thank you. Sachika?
Thank you. I have one comment for questions. for me, the intent of distinction between general questions and specific questions is not clear because I think there's some duplication. For example, I think question 1 small a asks area that, additional enhanced procedure should be required, but I think following questions such as question 3 to question 6 are examples of areas for additional or enhanced procedures. And also question 1 small b and small c ask scope of enhancement as well as how it should be mandated, but these are questions that also apply to each example or possible changes addressed in specific questions. So if we retain both questions, I think perhaps it's necessary to clarify what we want to hear by general questions as well as specific questions. My comment maybe perhaps addressed by try to distinguish question for non-auditors and auditors so that we can make clear for each question what we want to ask. But perhaps you, Bev and others, you can consider about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Sashka. Julie.
Yeah, Tom, I'll be brief, and it's really just to support what Bev has said about the change up to asking the questions in a comment letter format. I think that will bring out the richness of responses we'll get versus what I envision the survey would look like anyway, which is much more yes/no type questions. And I like the idea of having separate questions for separate audiences because I do think it provides more opportunity to have more open-ended questions potentially for those that might come up with new ideas that we haven't heard of before. And that was really my concern with some of the questions. It wasn't that I didn't think the questions were okay. It was just, are we narrowing the focus too much on a bit of a predetermined answer? And so anything that we could do to provide the opportunity for others to come up with great ideas, I think we should be open to that. So that was all.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And, my comments really reflect back on my earlier comments on the content. I agree with Sachiko and Julie that if we are keeping the very specific technical questions, that there's sort of a problem with the flow of the questions and how they relate to each other. That would need to be figured out. But to be honest, my preference would be to take out the technical questions altogether from this discussion paper and deal with them in a separate manner, because I don't think they're directly related to the expectation gap. I think they're, there's other reasons for considering them. And I think someone may have mentioned earlier an idea about having the brainstorming session on those questions prior to reaching out to stakeholders. And I think that's actually a good idea. And so perhaps the second phase of the first phase could be the expectation gap paper with the fairly high level ecosystem holistic view, and then follow with more detailed discussion questions on specifics of the standards rather than combining them in this one paper. I just think people are going to really struggle with answering these in the one paper. Thanks.
Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. Also in favor of targeting questions to different groups. Questions are very detailed, some of them very technical. And I think people like investors or preparers, they don't really care what ISA 240 mean or ISA 570. They just want to express what they want, what they need, what their expectations are. And that's what we want to hear. And same as Lynn, also concerned with question 4, because it could take us to a place that we as auditor do not really want to be. We could spend the whole year auditing non-material items, and it's going to be an endless process. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernando. Rich, I see Rich I think you're there, but I see just chords right now. Oh, there he is. Replaced by chords now.
It's funny, I was wondering what that button was for. I found out. A couple things. One, just wanted to echo that I think the decision Bev and the team have come up about going to comment letters is the right one, especially the types of topics we're trying to get to. You really want people to be able to put context as well as frame the discussion, and I'm not sure a survey would really do that. But so that's good, really good result. The comment that Lynn and now Fernando raised about non-material, again, I have very similar concerns. It hasn't been really discussed much, and it really goes further than just, hey, what do you think about doing this? Because it really goes from what really an audit is, if you're going to go down to that level of detail. As we had talked about before, and others talked about, and I think Eric was reflecting on, the detail of some of the questions, I think, sort of puts out a balance of with the ecosystem. I'm not sure I go as far as Eric, although I could, separate the two. But if you're going to keep it all together, I think you really need to bring that detail up and make more open-ended questions, and not, do you want to add this type of thing, procedure to this type of an audit, but what, really open, and what kind of procedures and what kind of audits did you do on. So I just think again, the questions are a little bit too targeted for what we're trying to get out of. Thanks, Tom.
All right, thank you, Rich. I think that comment and about the targeting, I think Bev alluded to that up front and getting the right balance, but you need to be targeted. My experience, I think all of our experiences, if we don't ask enough specific, being too open-ended generates very little input, but being too targeted, maybe too leading, or too far, get people too far into the weeds as well. So that's a real important balance we need to find here. So.
Thanks. I'm supportive of the direction that this seems to be heading in with the comment letters and providing capacity for some more open answers. I've sent some comments in. The main thing I just wanted to highlight is that in a number of places, I think it's really important that we don't lose the scalability and the cost benefit parts of the question in relation to the specific items that we're asking about. If those things are left until a kind of final wrap-up question, then I think it will lose the impact of the discussion around specific responses and how that will impact different stakeholder groups, and also that cost benefit consideration. Thanks.
Thank you. Isabel.
Like some others, the combination of some very detailed proposed responses together with the detailed questions gives really the feeling that it's more than a paper for discussion. It's a kind of exposure draft. And I know that many people will read it as being a commitment. Like some others, I would prefer to have questions that are less focused, not to give this feeling that we already discussed these topics and that we are proposing this. I really had the feeling at some point that I missed one step and that I missed a task force or a board discussion on this topic, because what we are proposing is so detailed that it gives the feeling that it has been discussed in length by the board, and it's not. So I think we have to be very clear with that.
Thank you. Any other hands raised? No, I don't see anyone. Anyone else like to come in that hasn't come in on the topic? Okay, a lot of recurring themes here that I think by moving it this whole concept of moving it to 120 days, inviting comment letters, that was universally agreed to. This idea of targeting different communities indifferently supported. Some caution with being too targeted in our questions. It may give a false impression that we have our mind set on particular outcomes. It also may scare people off from participating as well by being overly technical. So all those seem to be feedback. So maybe a trimming of the questions makes sense. Did you hear anything else?
No, I think we've discussed most of the changes. So we definitely need to look at the questions. So we will have a good look at them before we finalize this. Thanks.
Tom, the only other thing I wanted to add is that, and I think it was similar to Rich's point, what we don't want to do though is have different questions for different audiences, because we do want to hear on similar points from the whole range of our stakeholders. But I think the point about not making them too detailed and bringing them up another level will actually help us get there.
Yeah. Okay. All good points. Now, I'm going to do the final section a little bit different, but it's the assumption at some point we want to publish something. I'm not asking that question yet, but I think I've heard implicitly in the discussion that 120-day comment period for a document such as this in this period of time seems appropriate. Is there any objection to moving from 60 to 120, which is, I don't see any. So I wanted to just deal with that issue. The question is, are we based with accounting for the feedback and therefore willing the ability to update the document to reflect the feedback, ready to publish? Bev, I think or Vili, describe how we had originally intended to do that, assuming that people were comfortable, and then we'll get feedback from that. And then there could be another alternative to suggest a slight twist on that.
I'll leave this one to Vili to answer.
No, so Tom, to answer your question, coming into this call, the plan was that based on the feedback we received, we can go back and finalize the discussion paper and then clear it between you, Josephine, Fiona, and myself. That was the plan going into the call.
Yeah, we've had, like, to me, my read of the call is that, with maybe one or two exceptions, that there was general support for the thrust of the paper, but there are some significant comments and amendments that would have to go into place before we go out. So another slight alternative to that is we expand that board review to say, instead of 3 board members, because some included in that, to get it up to 6 board members to review it. And so with a diversity of board members on it before it would be cleared and put out. And so I want to get a sense, and then what would we anticipate the publication schedule for this to be, assuming that goes smoothly, Bev? I just want to try to set this discussion up because there are cost and benefits of different approaches.
I think the original intention had been to get this out at the beginning of September, and I think we still need to aim for that date because we do actually need this for the roundtable. And I know that there've been comments that perhaps we need something else to support it, but there will be some at the roundtable that would find this of value, and I think it will add some to the roundtable. So I would like it to get out at least 2 to 3 weeks before the roundtable, which is the 28th of September. So the original plan had been the beginning of August. We can perhaps push that a little bit. If we need another board discussion, that will throw that whole timing out. So we would have to re-look at how we do that. But I think we could still meet sort of the first or second week of September if we had this sort of shortened review process. So the original one plus a couple extra members. Thanks.
So 3, I would suggest like 3 extra members, and then to really make sure that we've addressed the points. So obviously it's a balancing act, and you have to determine the cost benefits. I think someone said earlier that it is a discussion paper and won't be the last word on this topic, but yet you have to balance with it. Do we get it right to get the right type of feedback that we want? So I'll ask whether people are in support of approving this with sort of that enhanced review process that we talk about, or really feeling like we need another round of board input on as a full board level before it goes out, with the knock-on effects, recognizing that there's pros and cons for each. Isabel.
I had an alternative proposal, which was to have a fatal flaw review by all the board members, because I know personally I would be really frustrated not to have the ability to read the document and be able to raise if something seems really strange for me, because it's released. So maybe if we can consider that without having a board discussion, but at least having the ability for all the board members to read it and be able to raise it to staff if we have a significant concern. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, though, on the timetable, recognizing if you're going to hold that with a fatal flaw review, or it goes simultaneously out to people, the turnaround time would have to be quite quick to make this work. And I've seen fatal flaw reviews before that aren't entirely fatal flaw reviews. They're a whole round of comment. I'm not dismissing that, but it just, are you talking about you get 3 days basically to comment on it, and we take it back and we arbitrate on that basis, Isabel?
Yes, for me it would work, even if it's a short timeline, but really it's such an important document. I don't want to discover it being a board member at the same time when all the other stakeholders will discover it without having the ability to raise my hand if there's something really fatal.
Okay. So your modification is the enhanced clearance, as we talk about, with everyone having an opportunity to review on a short time frame. So with the idea that it could get out in the first or second week of September. Am I reading you right? Okay. Okay, I take that. Julie, your hand went up immediately after our modified enhanced review approach. Did you have a suggestion?
Not a different one, Tom. I was just going to support your suggestion around having a smaller subset of the board review. I think, at least from my perspective, there's been a number of themes that have come out on this call, and I thought that the smaller group would be able to incorporate those themes into the paper. But so I was just going to support your original suggestion around the smaller group.
Okay. It's just really, I don't object to sharing it with the whole board in the next round. It just really is will have to be a very tight turnaround. And I know people like to be thorough. So I think it makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that people, when we set it down and we say it's like 4 or 5 days to review, that people don't, that's if you would believe you're ready to go too. Don't get upset that we mean in very tight time frames here. Rich.
Yeah, so I'd be on Isabel's camp. I think if it's a short time frame, it's a short time frame, but I find this is a very important document. Clearly, I prefer, I guess, another board session, but I understand the timing and what we want to try to get done with the outreach. So my alternative would be just a short time window to get comments, but it would be comments, I mean, it's a big document, and I think there are some big changes coming here. That the tone is going to switch from what it is in the current paper. So that's important.
Sorry, point well received. Eric.
Yeah, just Rich said it better than I could. I think that there are going to be some significant changes, and so I think the board needs a chance to see those before it's finalized. But I acknowledge there's a time crunch.
Okay. We have seen some convergence around that. Honestly, I have to ask Bev and Angela, since we're pushing on your 28-hour days already, what the feasibility of all of this, and sort of to help align people's calendars to be ready, because as I said, it will be tight. Not that this is a problem, but I'm trying to manage our internal. I know you all have other jobs to do and other responsibilities, but also staff has to do a lot of work now.
Yeah, so I think if we aim to get it to the board the first week of September, we'll push the publish date out a little bit, with the hope that we can then finalize it quickly and get it out about 2 weeks before the roundtable. I think the only thing that I'm thinking of is more everybody on the board, and that's that you'll have all the QM papers at that point. So it will be coming during the period that you're preparing for the September board meetings. But we could look to getting it done by then. There's some big task force meetings coming up in the next 2 weeks that we need to focus on. So there's a little bit of a delay before we can actually start working on this paper too much. But Angela will be able to focus on it, I think, in the meantime. So I do think we can get it done. But if it comes to the board for fatal flaw, it'll be during your preparations for the September board meeting.
Okay. Kaiue.
Thanks, Tom. As others, I'm in favor in a fatal flaw review. Thanks.
Okay. I think we've made some progress here and have a process. Let me try to restate this, that we'll ultimately have a slightly bigger enlarged group to clear the document. And I'll ask for 3 more board members to join Josephine, Fiona, and me in that process. That we will have the benefit when we clear of comments from the full board, because everyone will get an opportunity to review it, but recognizing it's in a relatively tight window, and those comments will be sought probably the first week of September. Is that correct, Bev? And there may be some bilaterals from now and then if we need some help with addressing a topic or two that, or comment that's been raised. So don't be surprised if we reach out, but I think this is such an important topic beforehand to get your input before we release it. And we try and just streamline the process. So does that seem like a reasonable proposal to everyone? By show of hands, digital hands, whether you're in support of the processes I laid out. Okay, lower your hands. I should have gone in the reverse, but I wasn't assuming anything. Does anyone object to that process? Lower your hands, make sure you lower them. Kai, do you object or you're in favor? Kaiue?
I'm in favor. Okay,
your hand was still raised. I went the up. I had such an overwhelming show of support for this. I call it the modified, then modified again by Isabel approach to review before we get this out. Thank you, Isabel, for that suggestion. I feel more comfortable that the board is getting another crack at this, but also appreciate everyone's willingness to respond rapidly. I go back to Imran's point earlier that there's so much so much public interest in this topic that we need to proceed with all due speed on it. But of course, we want to do it in a high quality way. So we're trying to get that balance right. We're somewhat constrained by the roundtables that are already scheduled and the people. And my understanding is that people are already getting ready to come and participate, right? So that is a little bit of a hard stop on some of this. Bev, Angela, Josephine, anything else you want to add, or before we ask anyone for comments on any other matters related to forward going concern?
No, I just wanted to thank the board very much for all of the comments. I think it's always a process, and I think all of these comments put together, hopefully we can get something that we can all agree on to stimulate the discussions and the comments that we're looking for. So thank you.
Does anyone want to raise any other issue around Florida going concern before I invite Julie? I'm going to invite Marcus and Jim also.
Sorry, Tom, really quick. There was a place in the paper we talked about LCE and the roundtable for LCE with respect to fraud. I just wondered if there might also be an opportunity at that roundtable to touch on going concern. It was just not noted in the paper. I just wondered if it, while we have the group together, if it was an opportunity to touch on both topics.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And I'd had a brief conversation with Julie about this yesterday. And when we had originally started thinking about it, we always think of fraud and LCEs because that's what gets highlighted, probably not as much about going concern, but I think it is a really good add to that roundtable. So I think we will broaden that out roundtable to cover both topics so that we can get those unique perspectives. And I think that will also help to inform both the development of the separate standard and the CUSP working group as well. So definitely both topics into that roundtable. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Rich.
Yeah, Tom, I mentioned earlier about considering outreach to basically politicians or the like, G20 or whatever. And I understand that might be difficult in an outreach type event, but I do think we need to not just put it off to the side, say it's a job too hard. They influence quite clearly direction, and they influence regulators and inspectors that fall underneath them. And so I wonder if it is too hard to try to arrange that for our outreach. I wonder whether it's something you, in your board chair role, could put on your agenda to see how that possibly you can get that connection, and they can see that the board's actually doing something. They can add their concerns or thoughts. Again, might not be, it might fall in deaf ears and no one will ever respond to you, but I think it would be worthwhile for us to show that we're willing to go to whatever lengths that we need to get the right input.
Rich, I thought about that too, and one of the things we should do is certainly any of the major inquiries that have raised this issue, we should reach out and alert them to this discussion and get, just like they sought our comment, seek their comment and participation in the process. Eric?
Sorry, just one more question. On the technology and LCE roundtables, just wondering, are there going to be materials for that, those roundtables, and do you have a timetable on when those will be available and who's going to look at them?
Yes, so for the roundtable, we have a number of participants. I think there's about 20 locked in. There's probably one or two we're just trying to confirm at the moment. We have an agenda, supporting paper that we'll send to the participants with the questions. And then actually we've got something in Tom's closing notes, but I'll just say it now, is that if any of the board members did want to actually observe those, please let us know so that we can include you on any distributions of the materials to support the roundtables. So the fraud one, it's currently out for quality control reviews. We're hoping to get it out by the end of this week for that first technology roundtable. Thanks.
Thank you. I apologize for everyone that we're slightly over time, but I assume that people are willing to be patient when they, or maybe not willing to be patient, but haven't told me that you're not going to be yet. But this is a really important topic, so I'm glad we're making progress. Okay, I want to invite this, as you can see, Marcus, so we made a commitment to the PIOB that we would act quickly on fraud and going concern. We are acting quickly, but I certainly invite your input and your observations on our discussion so far.
Thank you, Tom, but I'm quite happy with what you are proposing, and I have no problems with extending the deadline to 120 days. So it was more, you heard my comments before, but apart from that, I'm fine.
Right, and I think, Marcus, your comments were similar to other board members' comments and will be reflected in the next round of edits. Thank you for that. Jim.
Tom, I'm just happy that the fraud and going concern are being addressed, because it has been an issue that has come up with at the last CAG meeting, and it'll be good to be able to report progress.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, so really good discussion here. I think we got really robust feedback and sense of where this discussion paper needs to go and how we can get it out still in the time frame that we want to be in, to get the 120-day clock ticking. So thank you for that, and thank you for your willingness to respond quickly when we do send you the next draft. In terms of thanks, really big thank you to Bev and Angela, Josephine, the staff, and Billy, everyone who's been involved in the process to date. We've been getting regular updates from them. The amount of research that has gone into the preparation of this document has been phenomenal. I'm not sure when you sleep in this process, but thankfully for our sake, so you're not sleeping very much, because we've got to this discussion today. It's always difficult to put a straw man out there because people will respond. So thank you for that. And we look forward to the next draft. The minutes for this session will be distributed shortly to the board. As always, come back to Armand with comments. Also comments on the June 2020 meetings when they're distributed. As we know, as Bev Dark, 3 roundtables are coming up: September 2nd, September 28th, and October 7th. If you'd like to observe, let Angela know. Of course, you could also do it like everyone else as a YouTube follower and lock that into your favorite channels on YouTube. It's good stuff. Our next IAASB meetings are scheduled, the board, for September 20. Yeah, it's virtual, as all of them in the near future will be. It's going to be spread out over a few sessions, September 14th to September 23rd. Our agenda is now on our IAASB meeting pages. We have video conferences for the 4th quarter on the 10th and the 11th of November. The one that was previously scheduled for the 21st of October is now the 10th of November. Billy provided full details of this in his 27 July email to the board. And the CAG is coming up. We have a CAG meeting on September 8th through 9th, also to be held virtually. Those board members who need to participate, particularly the task force and working group chairs that need to help us present, they've been informed already, so you should have it marked on your calendars. Thank you all again. I appreciate your willingness to stick on the extra 15 minutes. For everyone else, have a great day. If you're just starting it, for people who are finishing it, have a good end to your day. And for those who are ready for bed, good night. And I'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.